Welcome to Guide to the Global Economy. I'm Josh Lipsky, the director of the Atlantic Council GeoEconomics Center. And today we're going to take you inside our thinking about the pressing issues in the global economy that others are missing. We look at the intersection of national security, finance, and economics. We're going to look at a range of countries and a range of challenges facing the world. But we're going to start with Assistant Director of the Center, Niels Graham, to take us through our lead. Niels, good to see you. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So, the lead this week, we wanted to focus on Russia's economic relationship with China, but do something that people hadn't been thinking about. There's a lot of conversation on trade, but you and I and the team agreed something's missing from that conversation.
No, you're right. We would say the dominant focus of kind of the Russia-China dialogue has been on trade, really looking at oil flows especially, and we want to take a slightly different angle. So we decided instead to focus on kind of Russian financing, looking at financial ties between Russia and China. Now, this is a really opaque relationship to begin with. So one way ultimately we found to look at it is really through syndicated loans, which really works well because that's the primary way that banks provide development financing overall.
Well, talk to me about syndicated loans for a minute, because we had a debate of this internally. What is a syndicated loan?
Sure. So a syndicated loan is pretty similar to a regular loan that you or I might receive from a bank, but rather than it being from just one bank, it's a group of banks who work together to provide financing. And it really is a primary way banks provide cross-border financing so they share risk across a member of different groups. So one great example of a recent syndicated loan that really has nothing to do with Russia-China financing, but maybe is a good way of understanding it, is how Elon Musk got a lot of his funding for his deal to buy Twitter.
Okay, that's a great example, relevant to many people, not Russia-China related, but it's important to know that this is how a lot of international finance is done. Okay, let's look at the data. So this was our lead chart this week. Walk us through it.
Sure. So what we're looking at here is really where Russia has been kind of financed, or where the banks that Russia gets a lot of its financing come from. What you can really see in this chart is really after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, Russia really made a concerted effort to pivot towards China for its financing. And Chinese finance went from around 15% during the point of annexation to nearly 50% where it sits at now. And while China's rising, we really see the rest of these kind of Western institutions declining, deleveraging themselves from Russia. I think the EU's notable one especially, jumping from around 33% now to where it sits a little under 25%.
And when we say the EU and China, we're not talking about the governments themselves. We're talking about commercial banks within those countries. Is that right?
Exactly, exactly.
Okay, so when we look at this, we see what's happened since 2014. We see China rising, but this must present enormous risks, both for China being so heavily invested in Russia, and Russia being so reliant on one country or one set of banks within a country.
Yeah, I think the risk is primarily on Russia's side. So first, in the short term, China's not really in a place where it can provide a lot of immediate financing. The Chinese economy itself is in a very different place than it was in 2014 when this pivot began happening. Back then, China was booming, growing at 7%. Its banks were flush with cash and able to kind of provide Russia its financing needs. Now China is really focused internally on supporting its own economy. So a lot of its banks are now kind of lending to its own property sector, its own manufacturing sector, and we've seen Chinese international lending actually drop 14% overall. So as Russia needs increasing financing, Chinese banks may no longer be as willing to give it to them.
Okay, so what's interesting is that as we continue to track this, this number might plateau or even go down. That wouldn't be what Russia wants, but there may be no other option.
No, but I would say this is a relatively short-term risk. You know, China is looking to internationalize its financial sector. Right now, it's incredibly closed off. And depending on how the Russia-China relationship develops in the future, Russia could be a very friendly country for China to begin testing how it opens its financial sector, how it's able to integrate other banks into its own financial sector, and as a result, use it as a first initial testing ground. So it's a great opportunity for China, but on Russia's side, it's now increasingly dependent on a singular country for a lot of its loans. So let's say the relationship does sour. Suddenly, no longer do they have the West to turn to, but now China will also be kind of turning their back on it, and they're really left with no other international partners to provide financing for.
Wow. Russia as China's internationalization of finance testing ground is an interesting concept. Yeah. Thanks, Niels.
No, thank you.
So now we're going to begin with our Under the Radar section. This is where we explore a country or an issue that everyone else is overlooking, and we try to find the linkages between national security and economics that might be driving a decision that matters not only within that country, but potentially across the region and the world. And I'm pleased to welcome in Sophia Bush, Managing Editor of the Guide. Sophia, welcome.
Thank you.
So we chose Nigeria as one of our Under the Radar countries this week. Why Nigeria?
So they have an election coming up on February 25th, but when we started looking into Nigeria because of the election, what we found that was a little bit more noticeable for us in our work is that on March 1st, there's actually a new law where government officials can't withdraw even 1 naira without, coming under investigation.
They can't withdraw even 1 naira, which is, of course, pennies on the dollar, but without coming under investigation, and that takes effect in a matter of weeks, potentially?
Yeah, March 1st, so just around a week after the election.
Well, what's the motivation behind the new rule?
So there's a lot of corruption and anti-money laundering motivations behind this, but it also is part of Nigeria's push to go cashless, which has been an ongoing effort since around 2012.
We know from our other work they have a central bank digital currency. So this is all part of a cashless anti-corruption effort on behalf of the government?
Yeah, so they have a CBDC, the e-Naira, and they've been working to put these things in place. And that's really taken off in the past month. So on January 9th, there's a new law in place restricting how much both individuals and companies can withdraw from, ATMs or over the counter.
What's the cap that they have?
So for individuals, the cap is around what equates to $1,000 per week.
Oh.
And so to get above the cap, they would have to get written authorization from the CEO of their bank, or, and then on top of that, pay a 3% processing fee.
Well, this must be somewhat controversial within the country, right?
It's certainly controversial. The central bank governor, Godwin Emefiele, he's really taken some heat for this, and there's calls for his resignation. There's also some calls for his arrest.
The rest. Well, and he has an interesting history himself, not a typical central banking background, a political history as well, right?
So this year he did actually have a short-lived presidential campaign while he was
the governor ran for
governor.
president.
Uh-huh.
So this is like
Right.
Jay Powell running against President Biden.
Essentially, yeah.
And what happened?
Well, so it turns out it was unconstitutional for him to be both central bank governor and campaigning for the presidency, so he did have to withdraw his bid. But he is still the central bank governor, although there are calls for him to resign because of this.
So how do you see this all playing out? They're going to move, this is going to happen, it'll be somewhat chaotic, but will it help Nigeria's economy in the long term?
I think it's hard to say for sure, but I do think that because of the January 9th restriction and additional restrictions coming on January 31st, where they're bringing in new bills into circulation, all old bills will be void. I think there's really some ingredients for some chaos coming into play. Only around 33% of people currently use credit or debit cards, and there's only 4.5 banks per every 100,000 people. So in order to get new currency into circulation and for people to be able to get out the money they need, it's going to take time, and it's going to be certainly a logistical effort.
Well, we're going to keep paying careful attention to this because it matters not only to Nigeria's economy, but I'm sure other countries in the region are paying careful attention to it, and across the world. One, on their cashless efforts, will the CBDC work or not? And two, on these anti-corruption with new currency efforts. So thank you so much for looking into it.
Yeah, thanks.
So let's turn to our by the numbers section. This is the part where we try to figure out one interesting number, one graph that really captures something that's happening in the global economy. And I want to turn back to Niels Graham, Assistant Director, to take us through our data. Niels, this time we decided to focus on the stock market. It's a topic we come back to often, and we wanted to look at projections for the year.
So yeah, with this graph, we really want to see where folks are looking at the market for, what they see as the primary headwind risks going into the U.S. economy, what are the primary tailwind risks supporting the stock market. And I think we ended with a pretty interesting graph overall.
Let's take a look.
As you can see, I think one of the most notable things that you first see is just the incredible range between the high-end projections and the low-end projections. There's a 28 percentage point difference between these two, and this is not typical. Usually the bands are much, much tighter, and I think this speaks to the vast uncertainty facing kind of the U.S. economy overall, but particularly the U.S. market.
And so this is where the S&P would end up at the end of a year, 12 months from now, essentially.
Yeah, so how we've came to this chart is we looked at analyst estimates. I believe we took a poll of around 11 different major investment banks. And on average, these banks suggested a 2% overarching return for the S&P. But again, on the high end, we saw 14% from where we are now. On the low end, we saw negative 14% from where we are now. So it's just an incredible range, and one that I don't think we've seen in recent years.
It's pretty interesting because when you're in a recession year, as we may or may not be in 2023, markets actually tend to do well because they're forward looking. So what you're looking at here is a bunch of large financial institutions saying we're going to be in recession, and a bunch of large financial institutions saying we're not going to be in recession.
No, and I think it perfectly speaks to the main challenge of the Fed right now, which is engineering a soft landing. So I think some of the folks that we have sort of followed or some of the folks that we've talked to are relatively confident that the Fed will be able to kind of thread that needle, whereas other folks are much more pessimistic, and that's where we see some of this lower end projections lying.
Now, we always have to take this with a grain of salt. We like to keep ourselves honest at Guide to the Global Economy. When we did this last year, I think the projections were the markets would be up, S&P would be up, Dow Jones would be up, and S&P ended down nearly 20% on the year.
Exactly. I think going into it, the analyst average was nearly, I think, maybe 7 to 10%. And exactly to your point, we ended up down over 20% overall. So this by no means is final. This by no means is advice that you should trade on. But I think it's just very interesting to see where folks are suggesting the markets will end up towards the end of 2023.
Thanks, Niels. And thanks, everyone, for joining us for this inaugural edition of Guide to the Global Economy. We're going to continue doing this, take you inside the thinking of our center on the issues that are being missed in the global economy, but are extraordinarily important. We hope you join us.